As I mentioned a couple episodes ago, my big goal for 2026 is to figure out what the heck Catacombia actually is. Where do I fit in the board game ecosystem? Am I going to publish other people's games? Am I going to publish my own games? Am I going to go to go to another publisher to pitch my games? And big part of this is like I want to treat this like a PM and properly go interview people and understand how the industry works at a deeper level. And I've set a bunch of goals about this and reached out to tons of people, got ghosted by some, got conversations with others, and it's actually been really enlightening. So I wanted to check in and share one of the most interesting things I learned, which is about how I have a much clearer idea now of how distribution actually works. And I had a couple of really interesting conversations with retailers, distributors, and this new thing that I didn't know as much about, consolidators. And that's what I want to talk about today. So I'm going to kind of step back through it because I think it actually makes sense logically if you piece it together, starting with the retailer and then all moving all the way back to me. So I hadn't really thought as carefully about what are retailers really thinking about. And I talked to a bunch of them on the phone and have been kind of doing research about this. And there's some things that are actually, they may seem really obvious to you, but they weren't obvious to me. And I think it's partly because I'm so used to being in the software world. That's where I work day to day, where sort of distribution can be infinitely available. Like you can replicate software infinitely, and there's no such thing as shelf space. You're not so worried about real physical stuff. You're not thinking about the real physical world. But of course, in the world of board games, physics matters, right? Which is kind of funny and interesting. May sound so obvious to you, but it was not obvious to me, and I haven't been thinking about it that much up to this point. So the retailer's thinking about, every square inch of their shelf space is a bet. It's a bet on the future. It's a bet that they're going to be able to move whatever product is on that shelf at a reasonable margin so that they can make their money and pay their people and pay their rent and, keep on buying more games, right? So one pretty obvious thing is that they need to make basically generally about a 50% margin. So if you buy a game for $50, they bought that game for $25 from the distributor, right? So that's kind of fairly obvious. I did hear several retailers say that indie publishers have called them and been like, yeah, we're going to, it's a $50 game. We're going to sell it to you for 40. And they're like, oh yeah, that's like not how this works. So generally, for the vast majority of board games, the margin is about 50%. If you're something like Magic the Gathering, you could get a higher margin than that, but really it's like that's kind of the industry standard. So they're thinking about shelf space. They're also thinking about the fact that each relationship they have with a distributor or a publisher that they're buying from, there's some like non-trivial admin cost to that, right? They have to maintain the relationship. They have to fill out tax information. They need to like follow you as a customer and they have your contact information. They need to manage shipping and receiving. And when you send boxes, they have to pick them up. It's like there's some amount of like cost to just like having a relationship with a distributor or a publisher, and they want to minimize those so that they can work with people who can send them lots of games rather than working with a large number of people who each send them a small number of games. And part of that logic is also just driven by the economics of shipping, right? Shipping right now is getting more and more expensive, and it matters a lot how big your game is and how heavy your game is, right? And so it's just funny because I started thinking about this where it's like, I think a lot of times about like the demand for games or the price for games being driven by quality and reviews and these sort of subjective, like, oh, is it sticky? Is it addictive? Do people love this game? And sure, like demand is partly driven by those things. But from a retailer and distributor point of view, they're thinking much, much more about how big is this thing? How heavy is this thing? How much shelf space does it take? How expensive is it to ship around? Because if you're working with a large number of these different people and you have to each ship games in small shipments to the retail store, those costs scale up really fast. It's much more appealing for a retailer to work with a big distributor who can have a truck show up with a few pallets of games because the shipping cost per game plummets when you're able to do things in bulk. Again, if you are somebody who works in the real world, this might be incredibly obvious, but I've been so software brained that I have not thought about this before. Duh. I didn't get that before. So it really is much more like a commodity. Physics matters, physical space matters, weight matters. And that is why retailers at a deep level are much more inclined to say, I want to work with just a handful of really good distributors who are really reliable and have great return policies. And it plummets the cost of shipping and it makes our admin costs go down because we have fewer relationships to handle. All completely matters, right? So then that leads us to the distributors. There's a relatively small number of distributors out there, EDC and Alliance, and these companies who aggregate lots and lots of games, sometimes from their own publishers, sometimes from just other publishers who they want to work with, who bring together a large number of games. And these are basically giant sorting facilities, right? They work in volume because their margins are actually surprisingly very thin. Maybe not surprising to you if you've done anything like this before, but they work in volumes from publishers, and they're really trying to think about, because their margins are so thin, that they're trying to basically get volume and speed and to take as little risk as possible, right? They're not speculatively buying huge volumes of games that they may or may not be able to sell because they need to sell a ton of games to make any money. They also are not looking to like have a bunch of games sitting on their shelf for years. That's like dead inventory. That's toxic. That's very bad for business. And so they are trying to maximize basically quick volume, get stuff in from publishers, sell exactly as much as they bought as fast as possible, get it out the door. And they're just basically trying to move fast and furious with a very, very large volume of stuff. And in order to minimize the risk there, they work on this pre-order cycle, which I did not know about at all before last week. So what they typically do is before the sort of street date, which is a new term that I hadn't heard before, of a game, which is the day that a game actually hits retail stores. The street date is a date that all retailers want to be kind of aligned on and all distributors want to be aligned on, where everyone says this game is going to like come out on this date. It's going to be an event. It's something we can plan around. It's something we can have calendar around, and everyone's going to release it on the same day, right? And so then you can sell pre-orders based on that. So the distributors go to the retailers and say, here's this game, we're putting in our catalog, here's like a sell sheet, here's all the stuff that's exciting about it. It's going to be September 1st, it's going to be in time for the holiday season. Here's what's, here's why you should buy it, whatever. And then they gather a bunch of pre-orders, and then they're able to tell the publisher, here's exactly how many copies of that game we want to have. Maybe we'll get some extra for like damages or if people want to quickly reorder or whatever. But they're basically trying to minimize their risk and maximize volume by selling ahead of time. And this is to the retailer's benefit. This is to the distributor's benefit. And so the whole industry runs on this pre-order cycle that I really truly knew nothing about. This allows them to basically skip the guessing and skip all the overhead of like, oh, let's just buy a bunch of copies because we think they might sell. That's not how this works, right? So then everyone gets synchronized around this pre-order date. So this kind of explains how retailers and distributors work together, but it leaves this huge problem for people like me because retailers are like, why do we want to work with some random publisher, add a new account to our thing, pay for shipping, which the shipping on 6 copies of Colossi is monumentally more than it would be if it was in a pallet with a bunch of other games, and manage this relationship and do all this stuff on something we got to take a risk on. They don't even have the backing of a real distributor. Like, it's a huge amount of risk. It's a huge amount of cost, and it's a big problem, especially from a shipping cost perspective. And the distributors are like, hey, there's obviously a huge cost for a distributor to have a relationship with a publisher. And so they're looking at you and saying, you don't have volume. You have one game. We're not even going to respond to your email. Most of them don't even respond to your emails. And I understand it. Like, economically, it makes sense. Like, they're talking about games that are selling like thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of copies of games. And when something new comes out that they're excited about, they're doing a pre-order cycle on something that has a lot more interest than your typical indie developer. And this is where the layer of consolidators comes in. I've mentioned them a little bit before. I work with this company called IndiePro, INDIPRO, who does this. And I am now getting into an agreement with Quartermaster Direct, which is a much bigger one who does this for lots and lots of indie titles. And what the consolidator does is they basically aggregate lots and lots of indie publishers. And basically, they get to represent one relationship, one vendor relationship with all of these distributors. And they have distributors all over the world and all over the US. They work with multiple different distributors. And they basically are able to tell these distributors, look, treat us as one publisher. We're not a publisher. We take whatever percentage of these sales and they go out and do the pre-order cycle for you. And they work with these distributors who are willing to listen to them because they have lots of indie titles, some of which are really commercially successful. And so they aggregate all these indie publishers together, and then they do the pre-sale, the pre-order cycle, and then they're able to come back to the indie publishers and be like, hey, we were able to sell like 600 copies, send them to our warehouse. We get to then ship them in this much more efficient way of doing things. They're also they're a subsidiary of Quartermaster Logistics, I believe it's called, which is a company that basically does this at scale to fulfill Kickstarters. And so they're like a subsidiary that does something similar where some people who run their Kickstarters will just send, when they get their shipment in from China, they'll send the whole thing to Quartermaster Logistics and they'll handle the whole thing for them. But it's super interesting. And it is part of what's appealing about it is that they were very nice and complimentary. And it was like nice to work with them, and they were educational and were willing to jump on the phone with me. James Takanaka is their representative who I talked to. He's their head of their sales division. He's been in the industry forever, and he was very kind to walk me through all this stuff. And I learned so much that I didn't know before. So now I know. I'm working with these consignment sort of consolidators, and I'm really excited. I was also sort of like surprised that I was like, hey, when you say pre-order date and like street date, like my game Colossi has been out there for almost 2 years now. Like it's not. And he was like, oh, that doesn't matter at all. And he's like, it's the Kickstarter that you ran. Like distributors don't know that you exist. They don't care about when your Kickstarter was. They care about when they can get synchronized between themselves and between the retailers about what the street date is. So they're going to get synchronized on that, and we're all going to talk about it and figure it out. And it's going to be before the holidays of 2026, and we'll see how many we can get out there and sell. Super interesting. I'll share more as I find out how it went. I haven't signed the contracts yet, but we'll be doing so this week. And very, very interesting. Maybe obvious to you. A lot of that was not obvious to me, but I feel much clearer now that I understand all of it.